Amen. All right. A little study of self-control. Now, I personally like this topic, and if you'll notice, we're starting to get into a little bit of a study of the fruits of the Spirit. And I was having a conversation with one of my preacher buddies this week, and we began to talk about these fruits of the Spirit. We so many times will overlook the meaning behind these things. You know, we see them as something that is supposed to be seen in a Christian. But at the same time, I think that might be even a little bit flawed as something that we're supposed to see in a Christian. I think more so that if you see these things, you're supposed to see a Christian. When you look at these things, these are fruits of the Spirit. Okay, if you were to plant an apple tree, okay, and you go outside and you find apples on that tree, it makes sense. Why? Well, because the fruit of an apple tree is an apple. Okay, well, the fruit of the Spirit, somebody who has the Spirit, okay, is to produce these things: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So when you see these things, they're meant to be a representation of the Spirit, the Spirit at work within your life, and as well you working within the Spirit in your life. And so when we look at these things and examine these various actions or these various words, one word at a time, always remember that these things are a show of your dedication to Jesus. And we made mention a few weeks back, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, last time we talked about the fruit of the Spirit, about the verses that correspond just before this, talking about the fruits of the world, or the labors of the world, the things that are produced by worldliness, these fleshly problems. And so you see these two contrasts. This one, it shows what happens when you follow after the world. Sexual immorality, lying, stealing, killing, this, that, and the other, fornication. But then the opposite of that would be the one who glorifies God and serves Jesus is one who represents these things like love, joy, peace, patience, etc. And so when we look at self-control, never fail to remember that these things are supposed to be shown in a Christian, because this is the natural reproduction of a Christian. We are to reproduce these things within ourselves. Why I say reproduce is because they've already been produced by our Savior, and we're to follow Him as our example. So when we look to Jesus and see the example that He has laid for us in self-control, we imitate these things, and then they therefore reproduce more self-control, love, this, that, and the other. So let's look at our first section this morning. Let's open to 2 Samuel. We're going to be looking at chapters 11 and 12. I'm not going to say I'll be impressed if we make it past this point, but I'm going to say that I'm going to be impressed if we make it past this. There's just a lot that goes on here in these two chapters. Before we even get to this, though, I want us to kind of remember something. We've talked about this here recently. Where was one of the first places that we saw David introduced into the story of the Bible? What's one of the first things that we see David partaking in? Tending the sheep. And then what's next? War? Goliath. Okay? So remember something. You see a shepherd boy who's gone to war. That's one of the first things that you see. A shepherd boy who has gone to war. In fact, let's remember, why was David there at the battlefield? Was it to be a fighter? No. He was a food delivery boy. He was a delivery driver. He was bringing food to his brothers who were on the battlefield. All right, he's a shepherd who belongs in the field, but yet he is at the battlefield delivering food to his brothers. Okay? Now, remember, what is the description of the geography of where he is at? It's called a valley. All right? So it means a low place. He's in a low place, geographically speaking. And yet when he faces this giant, physically faces this giant, is it a spiritual high? If you'll remember that the entire time throughout the various conversations that David was having, both with Saul and with the armor bearer and with even Goliath himself, was this idea of God will provide or God will take care of me. This constant faith within God. Okay, now this part we're going to look at this morning when looking at the life of David. What we're going to see is we're going to see a king, not a shepherd. Kind of the same thing, but very different roles. The shepherd was to look over the flock. The king is to look over his kingdom. Okay? And then we're going to look at a place of war. A place that he should have been as the king. He was not there. And yet, as the little boy David, the shepherd boy, he wasn't supposed to be at the battlefield. except for to take food, and yet he was there. And then we're going to look at David's location. Now, if you remember, where is David's palace located in? Give you a hint. Starts with J, ends with Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Okay, now remember, what is the description of Jerusalem? A city that is set on a hill. Okay, so geographically speaking, we're not in a valley anymore. We're in Jerusalem, the city that is set on the hill. Okay, he's not on the ground. Notice where he is. He's on what? The rooftop of where? His palace. Typically the highest point within the kingdom itself. So on top of a hill, on top of the roof, on top of the palace, we find King David where he's not supposed to be. Now, you see the little shepherd boy who has great faith in God in the valley at a place of battle where he shouldn't have been. At least he was there to do a favor for his father, or a chore for his father, delivering food to his brothers. But he wasn't a man of war. He wasn't supposed to be fighting at the time. And yet he shows great faith and kills a giant, slays Goliath. And yet we see David now at his societal high as the king of Israel, on top of his roof, on top of the palace, on the city that is set on the hill, and yet we see him at his most spiritual low. I never want us to forget that when we see David in the valley and when we see David on the roof, we see the same person. A few years gap between them. There's been a lot of instances in wisdom that has surpassed by now. There's been great changes within David's life, but yet what we still see is we still see David, the man after God's own heart. The one who slayed Goliath is the one who is sitting or standing on his rooftop here in 2 Samuel 11. So let's start to read here in 2 Samuel 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. Notice there, the first thing that is mentioned here is almost a little jab at David here. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. He's not where he's supposed to be. David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So the first description that we see here is that it's springtime, and it's the time that most kings, or at least that all kings, should be out at battle. And yet where is David? He's in Jerusalem, and he sent all of his people to go and fight the Ammonites. Let's look at verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and walking on the roof of the king's house, he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Okay, let's pause here. Looking at verse 2, notice it says it happened late at night. I know y'all have heard the phrase because I'm pretty sure y'all's generation probably came up with the phrase. Nothing good happens after midnight, or nothing good happens after 2 o'clock, okay? Notice the first description given of this time period other than spring. It happened late at night, okay? David should have been in the battlefield, and at least not if in the battlefield. Where should he have been? Asleep. Should have been asleep. Now, there's many instances that show us in Scripture and many instances within our own lives that give us a little bit of an example of probably why David wasn't sleeping. You send all your men out to fight your battles and you're sitting in your kingdom. Okay, David was probably having a sleepless night. So what does he do? He goes out and he walks on his roof. Gets a little fresh air. And what he sees is a woman who is mentioned here in verse 2, a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Okay, let's skip back a little bit, kind of going to what we're studying on Wednesday night. What was the first temptation that was mentioned in Scripture? Not just of Adam and Eve, but what was the first specific type of temptation mentioned in Scripture? Lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. You know, you get all three of them all in that one little instance with Eve. You shall not surely die, the fruit was beautiful to look upon, all these things. What do we see here with David? All right, David is at his societal high as the king on top of his palace, looking over his kingdom. He looks down and sees part of his kingdom. He sees this woman, this Bathsheba. She's beautiful to look upon. And he sees her bathing. Now notice here is where the problem enters. Verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Okay, you see, he sees this beautiful woman. If you would have just looked at verse 3 and it said, and he turned his eyes and went back inside, we wouldn't have this story and we wouldn't have this problem. The problem enters when David looks at this woman intently and sends for her. He wants to inquire about her. Now notice what his servant says to him. We don't get the servant's name, but man, sometimes you just wish that you could, because I'd like to know the man who stood up to David here. Because he's not like, you can't do this. Look at what he says to him. Verse 3. David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? You think he's trying to hint at something to King David here? It's a married woman. The one that you're looking upon is a married woman. Verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her, and they came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Okay, I want us to talk about something for just a moment. All right. When we look at this, sometimes the way that it looks is that David asked for her to come be with him, and that she agreed. David raped this woman. David used his authority as king to take this woman into his bed. This wasn't an optional come and see me kind of thing. That's a rough word to use. I particularly don't like to use it, but I never want us to fail to remember what truly happened here with King David. This wasn't that he saw a woman that he lusted upon and he made a move and she agreed. He took this woman by his authority without consent. Now notice what happens here in verse 5. The woman conceives a child, and she sent and tells David, I am pregnant. So this king, who is at his societal high, on top of his roof, on top of the city that is set on the hill, on top of the temple as king of Israel, looks at this woman, takes her by force, and conceives a child. When I look at this instance, you know what the first phrase that doesn't come to my mind is? The man after God's own heart. In fact, I see something that is far from it. This man used his authority to do something that is unthinkable, unspeakable, and ungodly. So how does this man have a description of the man's after God's own heart? If I'm not mistaken, the title for this day, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it was Losing Control, if I'm not mistaken. This is what happened to David. David lost all control. David was not practicing self-control in any manner. Even when he had some points where he could turn around. You know, the moment when he saw her, he could have physically turned around. The moment when he inquired about her and knew that she was married, he could have stopped. The moment after figuring out that she was married, he could have not sent for her to be brought to him. He could have thought about it while the messengers were out, but yet he didn't. His mind was focused on one thing, and he did something that was absolutely unspeakable. This is a group of adults, so I used that word. I'm not going to use it again, but I want us to never forget that what David did was not just wrong, it is vile and disgusting. And it is completely uncalled for, and in no way, form, or fashion is anything that would be glorifying to God. In fact, one of the main messages that Jesus taught, and one of the main messages that God delivered, was this different kind of worship to God. When it came to worshiping God, this very instance would have been something that was common for worshiping idols, to take somebody by force or to sacrifice a child. And God makes it very clear that those things are not pleasing in His sight, and those are not what He seeks for.
I believe David equated, God equated that to murder with Nathan's message to him.
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference. The one thing that was most precious to him and he took it in slaughter. It is compared and equal with murder.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, 4 lives, well, I guess 3 technically would have been ended because of this. The life of Uriah, the life of Bathsheba. I mean, you think now she's going to lose her husband. Her husband was murdered by her attacker, her predator. And then, of course, the baby is not going to make it either.
And about Uriah, if I remember right, the Hittites were David's inner circle of most trusted and protective of him bodyguards. They were totally devoted to David. They were those men listed as mighty men of valor who
Yeah.
did amazing things. It was beautiful the Hittite.
I don't believe you're mistaken in that, which means this could have been and probably was somebody that he knew specifically. Notice also that when the messenger is delivering the message to David, he makes mention of Uriah, the Hittite. Not just the Hittite, not just he's the wife of a Hittite, or she's the wife of a Hittite man, Uriah the Hittite. There's some indication that maybe David would have even known who Uriah was. Maybe not Bathsheba, but who Uriah was. This is a horrible, horrible thing that takes place here.
With them living that close to him, that sort of reinforces that ring of secret service
Yeah.
that would be around him if that were not at war. It's the reason their proximity to him, their home.
Would have been close. Because Jerusalem's not a small place. So for him to be able to look down and see, it had to be close to the kingdom. Notice what happens here in verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. Joab sent Uriah to David. When David came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go into his own house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, Have not come from a journey? Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark in Israel and Judah dwells in booths, and the Lord Joab and the servants of my Lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house, eat and drink, and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. What do we see here from these few verses about Uriah? Uriah was a mighty man of valor, but Uriah was a very noble man. Notice the reason behind him not going and sleeping in his bed and feasting and getting drunk and being with his wife. He said because the ark, which was a representation of God, is sitting in a tent on a battlefield, and your people, your servants, your warriors are sleeping in a field. So who am I to do so? Okay, once again, should be an eye-opening situation for David. Should be a reminder. All right, this is one of my soldiers, and I'm the king. And he is more noble than I. He has more valor and more honor than I.
Don't you think of the conversation before David?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stories back in there when he was trying to Saul was putting his armor, he was too big, and the lesson of the little boy. And now this little boy Hittite, it's not a little boy, but it's to me it's kind of the same.
He's a servant to the king. Yeah.
And being more honorable, doing the king's thing,
Yep.
doing the thing that the king ought to do.
And notice what happened to the relationship between Saul and David after that. A few years later, he finds himself seeking to kill him, and what happens with David here in Uriah? I don't even want to use the word irony, because in my mind, irony is almost laughable at times. But you almost see such a parallel that it's like, come on, David. You've been through this. You've been on his side. Notice what is said, though, here. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also and tomorrow, and I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. In the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go into his house. Okay, so David has sent a messenger to go and get Uriah from the battlefield, which would have taken at least a few days, if not a few weeks, to bring him back. Uriah gets back. is told to go be at home. Uriah sleeps at the door of his house and does not go in. He brings him back and waits for a few days and has him dine and feast with him for a day and a half, 2 days, this, that, and the other. Okay, so we're now probably within the range of 2 to 3 weeks of all this going down. And David comes up with this grand idea to get him drunk and then send him home, and maybe that will make him to lie with his wife, and he sleeps at the door again. So David has now had a few weeks, at least, since this instance has occurred. And yet David has still not had an eye-opening moment of, what am I doing? What is my thought process like? What's going on here? This is that sense of out of control. This is not the character of David that we've seen so far. He's made mistakes, yes, but this is a new territory for David. And yet, he is completely losing control, and yet he is continuing on this path of seeking to destroy Uriah the Hittite. Notice what is said here in verse 14. In the morning, David writes a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Okay, remember this. He writes a letter to a commander, or to one in charge, a general maybe, to Joab, and sends it in the hand of Uriah. Remember that for just a second. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. So David then, after a few weeks after sleeping with this man's wife, without her consent, calls for him to be back, tries to get him drunk and make him sleep with his wife, sends him back with a letter that is his death sentence. And Uriah the Hittite is carrying this letter back with him to the front lines, hands it to the commander, and in that letter is the command to put Uriah not just at the front, but to put him at the front of the hardest fight and then take a step back and let him die. He carries his own death sentence. You think at any point something would have changed had Uriah opened up that letter? Might have got lost in translation or lost in transition a little bit. What else does that show us about Uriah? We're seeing this valor. We're seeing this honor. We're seeing this mighty man here in Uriah. He carries his own death sentence in his hand back to the commander and hands it to him, and as a result, he dies.
David knew how honorable he was.
He wouldn't have sent him with it. Yep. And that's the saddest part about it. Is that if you want to summarize in 2 words the horror of this message here between David and Bathsheba, is David knew. He knew. At every point that things were going down, he knew what he was doing. He understood what he was doing. But yet he still allowed for that allowed for that to take place. Yeah. Yeah. Treat him like a friend or family. Yeah. Yeah.
So you would have thought that the face-to-face time would make him wake up and go,
Yep.
I can't do this to this guy.
Yep.
But it didn't. That was his big opportunity to change his mind. He didn't.
Didn't.
That goes back to show that they more than likely had a relationship because David knew he wouldn't open the letter.
Mm-hmm.
David thinking he didn't, that wasn't out of the ordinary apparently to Uriah because he was there and it was just, so it was, they were probably well versed in each other's, knowing each other.
Mm-hmm. And he's looking him in the eyes the entire time, knowing what he has done, what he's currently doing, and what he will do.
And saying,
Hey, take this note back to your... Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep.
Wasn't it the sin that David actually would that have been punished by death?
I'm sure in the military world it sure would have.
Yeah. Had it been Uriah, probably.
Or you might, just kids that have a child with her, out of wedlock.
Yeah, but you got to remember, who's David? Still subject to Jewish law, but in God's eyes, yes, he would have been put to death. But in practice, probably not.
It's also what God had Samuel to tell the people before that he will
Take your
daughters as his servants and as his for his own use. It was an explicit promise
Description.
that God told Samuel to tell the people.
And you know what? People thought that was fulfilled in Saul, and they didn't realize it would also be fulfilled in David. Remember what was said about David, the reason behind him not being able to build the temple. We talked about it a few weeks back. His heart was covered with blood. He had shed blood, so he couldn't build the temple. So he had taken their sons and he had taken their daughters. And guess what? Guess what Solomon did too? Give you a hint. Same thing. David was punished. Yes. He did.
His daughter was raped by her own brother. He said the man should be punished 3 times over. 4 times he was.
And his son even sought to kill him and dethrone him. You know, one of the craziest parts to me about the life of David is his deathbed scene. If you remember on David's deathbed, what does he begin to say to his son? Such and such is going to come after you, and this is how they're going to do it. This king is going to try and kill you, and this is how they're going to do it. So what do? You go kill them. David's last breaths on this earth were of ways to eliminate their enemies, of ways to commit more destruction and kill more people. Once again, not a very, first thing pops in my mind, man after God's own heart moment for David. And specifically right here. Like you said, the punishments would continue on for what he has done. But notice what is said here in verse 22. Start here. Wait. We didn't stop. We stopped reading in the middle. Well, come on. I lost my spot. 16, thank you. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there would be valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab. Some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, if he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall, who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Do you recognize something in the message that Joab is saying? Or do you recognize something that would have been present amongst David and Joab? First, you've got the servant who sent to bring Bathsheba to David. Well, actually, before that, the one who he asked about Bathsheba, the one that he sent, the few that he sent to go and get Bathsheba. Then you've got the ones who he sent Joab to go and get Uriah and bring him home. And then you've got Uriah himself. Now you've got Joab on the battlefield. All these people knew what David was doing. They were not blind to it. They were shown what had happened. They were seeing firsthand what had happened. So the sin that David is committing here is something that not just affects him and Bathsheba and Uriah. This is starting to affect the people around him. They would have known what was going on here.
And some of this less balanced men were also killed.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think you probably see the first part of the slipping of the respect
Yeah.
after David.
Yep.
It manifests itself later in the killing of Absalom. You know, he explicitly went against David. Remember now, he was David's uncle for one thing, and that was one of the reasons he was
In that position. Yeah.
But fiercely loyal to David. Probably one that insisted David stay home, let him go. But David forgot that Saul has killed his thousands.
David's killed. Yeah.
Joab was gaining that level of respect over David. It's just like
David did over Saul.
But after this, you see David and Joab's relationship
Changes completely.
with him being more
And
outspoken and more assertive against David sometimes, or kind of
just
not doing exactly
blatant,
what he told
yeah.
David, you know.
And you see,
His power was more than David's
Yeah.
in the military scenes.
well, you see also too the direct comparison to situations that we face in today's society. When you get people in situations like this, one of the first things that crumbles is loyalty, because especially in something that involves deceit. Because what's the first thing that's going through your mind? When is he going to do something like this to me? When am I going to be off to war and he's going to look down and see my wife? Next thing you know, I'm delivering a letter to the one in charge kind of thing.
And just also, you see the but there. It's
Yeah.
telling him all of this, and when he starts to question why we did it, we did it,
Yeah.
but your servant is dead.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it gives you a mind frame, because I'm sure that servant went back.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it gives him the mind frame of telling him, yeah, when I told him but, his whole demeanor changed.
You can almost see the letter stuck away in a box somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Just waiting. Blackmail. Almost, yeah. Let's push on just a little bit because I want us to talk about this mentality in Nathan in just a second. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. And the messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. And the archers shot your servant from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife, and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Okay, verse 26. Well, that collection there, 22 through 25, is very, very, very important. Kind of like what we were talking about just a minute ago. You got some dwindling relationships now. And notice what David says in verse 25. You win some, you lose some. That's David's mentality about the death of Uriah and the death of those mighty men. Well, sometimes the sword devours one, and sometimes it devours another. But be encouraged and keep fighting.
But in his state of mind, he won.
In his state of mind, he won. And at the same time, his conscience had become so seared that it seems as if it doesn't even bother David in the slightest. Well, like I said, that phrase that we would use today, you win some, you lose some. Now, tough luck. It's just how it goes. People die in war.
The thing that he says that and he's not fighting with them. He's
Exactly.
there beside them. It would have been easier.
Man, if only David had been on that battlefield. Instead, he's fighting with himself back in Jerusalem. Verse 26, when she hears that her husband had died, she laments. And here comes good old King David, the man after God's own heart, to be the shoulder to crown. When the mourning was over, not the M-O-R-N, but the M-O-U-R-N, mourning was over. When she was done lamenting her husband, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Notice, but the thing that David had done had displeased the Lord. Okay, notice that what is mentioned in verse 27, the first half of verse 27 occurs before the second half of verse 27, which leads us to believe that even when David takes Bathsheba to be his wife, this is still under that umbrella of things that God looks at with displeasure. Okay, David did not do a good and noble and great thing in this. He's trying to cover up his sin. He's trying to cover up his mistakes. And at the same time, notice what it said in verse 27. The mourning was over. David sent and brought her into his house. Let's go back just a little bit to verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. Okay, what happens in verse 4 is what happens in verse 27. He sends and he brings her to him. Okay, this is once again David forcefully bringing her into his house. This time to be a wife so that this mighty king can remain faithful in the eyes of his kingdom.
Well, he's done it before.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah.
And in that case, being, I guess, probably being righteous in that case was what Michael, who he loved, was taken from him. And so I don't know that he, even when he got her back, took her back down. But Abigail was a widow because of something David had done.
And noble King David. Yes, ma'am.
But she shouldn't have been vacant when he was there.
And at the same time, though, notice what she was doing. She was performing a purification ceremony. She was cleansing herself, which means that she was probably preparing to be able to go worship.
And we always have to be careful not to also blame the victim.
Yeah.
That it was a ritual, it was a custom. She probably wasn't doing anything that
Anybody else wouldn't have been doing it, yeah. But at the same time, it's early in the morning, you know. Yeah.
Then she would work safer for her to be than high above everybody
Yeah.
else too.
I'll go
It's-
back to if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing and where we're supposed to be.
Well, you don't have to worry about it.
that's the problem.
No. Let's look very quickly for the next 25 minutes. We're just going to have to keep going past our little clock there for a second. At what Nathan says. So, and he sent to Nathan, the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing but that one little lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up and grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd and prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. You're going to eat them words in a minute. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God, the God of Israel, I will anoint you king over Israel, and I will deliver you out of the hand of Saul, and I will give your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, and do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Okay, notice a few things. One, the sword will never depart from your house. Kind of like what you were talking about. There's going to be constant strife from this moment on. David has introduced some turmoil from this moment on. Two, Nathan was sent by God to deliver this message. He delivered this message to the man who had much and the man who had little. The man who had much stole from the man who had little. Notice there, stole from the man who had little. And David's response is, this man should be killed. Nathan responds with, you are the man, and therefore you will be repaid. You should be repaid fourfold. The hand of the Lord will strike you down, pretty much. Notice also, very quickly, what happens after this is what shows us why David is the man after God's own heart. We don't have time to dive too deep into it. But notice that David gets a little bit of a wake-up call, which he should have had, hopefully, several weeks before this. David gets a wake-up call and realizes his wrong, and then begins to mourn, even to the point where he's mourning as his child is fighting for his life. And notice what happens. Immediately when the child dies, what changes or what thing happens to David? He gets up, he goes eats, gets something to drink, gets clean-shaven, bathes, cleanses himself, and then goes on about his life. Why?
We can talk about 13.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about 13. None of the kids are in here yet. Let's talk about 13 very quickly. Okay, verse 13 here. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin, that you should not die.
What would have happened had David not done it?
Yeah.
David had not repented?
Yeah. We're given the consequence.
I have no doubt if he hadn't repented right then, that what he said would happen, that you shall surely die, he surely would have died. I think it's just like with Hezekiah and the prayer, I think David right there probably saved his own life away
For a while. Well, and also look at the kings that were to come after David, not of the United Kingdom. But what did they do to the prophets? They killed them or imprisoned them and told them to never speak the words again. David could have done that too, but he didn't. That shows the part where David is the man after God's own heart, but never forget all the horrible, horrible, wicked things that he did beforehand because he allowed for himself to become out of control. And all it took was a little mistake here, led to a bigger mistake, bigger mistake, bigger mistake, resulted in the loss of 3 lives and resulted in almost the loss of David's. All right. We will not pick up there next week. I wish we could. Don't forget, I'm going to go ahead and mention it for this morning and as well for Wednesday night. Because of the gospel meeting, we will not go over the lessons for this week. So you're on your own to study it. All right? We're not going to pick up in 2 weeks where this week is. We're going to stay on our reading schedule. So don't take a break this week. So read your 5 days this week. Study it for yourself. Read your 5 days for the next week during the gospel meeting, and we'll pick up.